Elderly woman humiliated at the bank. The staff freeze when Sandra Bullock arrives and takes over. Some stories begin in ordinary moments, but end up revealing the deepest parts of human nature. That's exactly what happened one Wednesday afternoon. In a busy downtown bank branch, the atmosphere was tense. Long lines of customers stretched across the lobby, some tapping their feet impatiently, others grumbling under their breath. Employees rushed back and forth, trying to handle the mid-month rush, but frustration filled the air. Amidst the chaos, there stood Eleanor Wilson, a 78-year-old retired elementary school teacher, clutching her handbag with trembling fingers. For Eleanor, this wasn't just a routine bank visit. It was about survival. What seemed like a minor discrepancy in her account, $1,500 mysteriously withdrawn, was for her a matter of paying for her heart medication, groceries, and next month's utility bills. Her modest pension only stretched so far, and this unexplained withdrawal had thrown her carefully balanced budget into disarray. "It'll be fine," Eleanor whispered to herself, adjusting her faded blue cardigan. "Just a computer error. They'll fix it." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. She had spent 3 hours yesterday on the phone, being transferred from one representative to another, before finally being told she needed to come into the branch in person. Eleanor glanced around the bank, taking in the sleek, modern furniture, and the bright digital displays advertising luxury vacations and home equity loans. How things had changed from the days when Mr. Peterson, the old bank manager, would greet her by name and ask about her students. Now everything was cold efficiency, or at least it was supposed to be. Near the customer service desk, Jessica Chen, a young teller with perfectly manicured nails and an expression of perpetual boredom, scrolled through her phone whenever her supervisor wasn't looking. To Jessica, this job was merely a stepping stone, and customers, especially older ones who didn't understand digital banking, were obstacles to be dealt with as quickly as possible. "Next customer to counter 4, announced the automated system. The numbers on the digital display changed, but Eleanor hesitated, double-checking her ticket. Yes, it was her turn. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her strength and walked toward counter 4, where Jessica was already looking past her, eyeing the clock that showed her lunch break was approaching. Not far from Jessica's counter, Marcus Daniels, the branch manager, stood observing the floor with arms crossed. With his expensive suit and carefully styled hair, Marcus looked the part of a successful banker. What wasn't visible was his mounting pressure to meet this quarter's targets. His superiors had made it clear: increase revenue or face consequences. Under his leadership, the branch had implemented several new service fees that were buried in the fine print of account agreements. Eleanor approached Jessica's counter, clutching a manila envelope containing her bank statements and handwritten notes detailing the unauthorized withdrawal. Her hands shook slightly as she placed the envelope on the counter. "Good afternoon," Eleanor said with a polite smile, the kind she had used to greet thousands of young students throughout her 40-year teaching career. "I need some help with my account." Jessica barely looked up from her computer. "Account number?" she asked flatly. In the waiting area, other customers shifted impatiently. A businessman checked his watch repeatedly. A young mother tried to quiet her fussing toddler. An elderly gentleman with a cane stared vacantly at the wall, perhaps facing his own banking troubles. None of them knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. Outside the bank's glass doors, life in the busy downtown district continued. People hurried past, engrossed in their own concerns. Cars honked in the congested afternoon traffic. And just down the block, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. Back inside, Eleanor fumbled with her reading glasses, trying to locate her account number on her statement. "I'm sorry, I know I have it right here," she said, feeling the weight of Jessica's impatience bearing down on her. "Ma'am, there are people waiting," Jessica said, not bothering to hide her annoyance. Eleanor's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her fingers now trembling more noticeably as she sorted through her papers. "Here it is." She read out the number, her voice softening with each digit as though trying to make herself smaller, less of an inconvenience. Jessica typed the number into her system with sharp, rapid keystrokes. "And what seems to be the problem?" she asked, though her tone suggested she had already categorized whatever it might be as unimportant. There's a withdrawal of $2,500 from my account last Thursday, Eleanor explained, pushing forward a bank statement where she had circled the transaction in red pen. I never made that withdrawal. I need that money returned. It's for my heart, for medication and— Let me stop you right there, Jessica interrupted, holding up a manicured hand. If the transaction is in the system, then it happened. The system doesn't just make up withdrawals. Eleanor blinked, taken aback by the dismissive response. But I didn't withdraw that money. I would remember taking out such a large amount. Jessica sighed loudly, drawing glances from nearby customers. Memory can be unreliable as we age. Perhaps you forgot? The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. After decades of shaping young minds, after raising 2 children alone following her husband's early death, after carefully managing her modest finances through years of inflation and economic uncertainty, to be dismissed as simply forgetful because of her age felt like the cruelest insult. Little did Eleanor know that in just moments, everything was about to change. Outside, a woman in sunglasses and a baseball cap stepped out of the black SUV, briefly scanning the street before heading toward the bank's entrance. No one in the bank yet realized that Sandra Bullock, one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses, was about to walk through those doors, and what began as a routine afternoon would become anything but ordinary. Eleanor Wilson stood at counter 4, her heart racing as Jessica stared at the computer screen with disinterest. The young teller's eyes narrowed as she scrolled through Eleanor's account history. As I said, there's a withdrawal of $2,500 last Thursday at 2:37 p.m., Jessica stated flatly. It was processed at this branch. She turned the screen slightly, pointing to the transaction line as if that alone should end the conversation. Eleanor leaned forward, squinting through her reading glasses. But that's impossible. I was at my granddaughter's piano recital that entire afternoon. I couldn't have been here. Jessica's lips tightened into a thin line. The system doesn't make mistakes, Mrs. Wilson. If it shows you made a withdrawal, then you made a withdrawal. Eleanor pulled out a small calendar from her purse, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped to last week's page. Look, I've written it right here. Sarah's recital, 1:30 p.m. I was at Roosevelt Elementary School until after 4. Several customers in line had begun to listen in, their expressions a mix of impatience and discomfort. An older gentleman, 2 people behind Eleanor, shifted his weight from one foot to another, his eyes showing sympathy. Perhaps you made the withdrawal before the recital, Jessica suggested, her voice dripping with condescension. Or maybe someone you authorized used your account. Eleanor shook her head firmly. No, I live alone and I've never given anyone access to my account, not even my son, and I certainly didn't withdraw that money myself. Jessica sighed dramatically, making a show of her growing frustration. Mrs. Wilson, banks don't just lose money. That's not how this works. Eleanor felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. This money wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was her lifeline. Please, she said, her voice quieter now. That 500 tons is for my heart medication. Without it, I can't— I understand you're upset, Jessica interrupted, though her tone suggested anything but understanding. But there's nothing I can do if the system shows you made the withdrawal. A few feet away, Marcus Daniels, the branch manager, had been watching the exchange with growing irritation. Customer complaints were bad for business, especially when they happened loudly enough for others to hear. He straightened his tie and approached counter 4, his practiced smile not quite reaching his eyes. Is there a problem here? He asked, directing the question at Jessica rather than Eleanor. Jessica nodded toward Eleanor. Mrs. Wilson is disputing a withdrawal from last Thursday, claims she never made it. Marcus turned to Eleanor, sizing her. Up in an instant. Sensible shoes, outdated purse, drugstore reading glasses. Not a high-value customer, not worth too much time, yet making enough noise to disrupt his branch's efficiency. Mrs. Wilson, he began, his voice professionally pleasant but cool. I'm Marcus Daniels, the branch manager. I understand there's some confusion about a transaction. Eleanor felt a momentary surge of hope. Surely the manager would help sort this out. Yes, Mr. Daniels, There's a $2,500 withdrawal from my account that I never made. I need that money back. It's for my heart medication, and without it—" Marcus held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. If our system shows the withdrawal was made with your card and your PIN, then from the bank's perspective, everything is in order." "But I didn't make that withdrawal," Eleanor insisted, her voice stronger now as desperation pushed through her initial embarrassment. "I've been banking here for 43 years. I've never once claimed there was a mistake before." Marcus's smile tightened. "And we appreciate your loyalty, Mrs. Wilson. But you understand that memory can become less reliable as we age." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with humiliation. Around her, the bank had grown quieter. Other customers pretending not to listen while catching every word. "I may be 78, Mr. Daniels," Eleanor said, drawing herself up to her full height of 5'3", "but there is nothing wrong with my memory. I did not make that withdrawal." Marcus exchanged a knowing glance with Jessica, the kind of look that spoke volumes. Just another confused elderly customer wasting our time. "Mrs. Wilson," Marcus said, lowering his voice as if speaking to a child, "we take security very seriously at this bank. Our systems have multiple safeguards. For a withdrawal of that size, you would have needed your card, your PIN, and you would have been on camera." Eleanor's eyes widened. "The cameras, yes, check your security footage. You'll see I wasn't here." Marcus cleared his throat. "Unfortunately, our security footage is only accessible through formal channels. It would require a police report alleging fraud, an official investigation, and—" "Then let's call the police," Eleanor interrupted, reaching for her cell phone. "This is theft." Marcus's professional facade cracked slightly, his jaw tightening. "Mrs. Wilson, I strongly advise against making accusations without evidence. Filing a false police report is a serious offense." The threat was veiled but clear. Eleanor's hand, halfway to her purse, froze in mid-air. "I suggest," Marcus continued, his voice dropping further, "that you go home and check your records carefully. Perhaps you used the money for something and simply forgot. It happens to people." At your stage of life, the humiliation was complete. Eleanor stood, surrounded by strangers, being told that her own experiences couldn't be trusted, that her word meant nothing against the cold authority of a computer screen. "Is there someone who helps you with your finances?" Marcus asked. "A son or daughter, perhaps? Maybe it would be best if they came in with you next time." Eleanor's vision blurred with unshed tears. After a lifetime of independence, to be treated as incapable, as a burden, cut deeper than any physical pain. "I've managed my own money since my husband died 30 years ago," she said quietly. "I've never needed help." Marcus nodded, his point made. "Well, perhaps it's time to consider some assistance. Banking can be complicated these days with all the technology." Just then, the bank's glass doors swished open. A few customers glanced over, then returned to their phones or stared ahead blankly. No one yet realized who had just walked in. Eleanor, fighting back tears, gathered her papers with shaking hands. "So you won't help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm helping you, Mrs. Wilson," Marcus replied. "I'm helping you understand how our systems work. The withdrawal was properly processed according to our records. There's simply nothing to investigate." From across the lobby, a woman in sunglasses and a baseball cap observed the scene, her expression hidden behind large frames. But her body, language changed, tensing, as she watched the elderly woman's shoulders slump in defeat. Someone was about to change everything. Eleanor felt as if the floor beneath her was dissolving. The bank lobby seemed to stretch endlessly around her, faces blurring as she clutched her manila envelope like a shield. She had come here expecting help, perhaps some confusion to work through, but certainly not this, not being treated as if her age had rendered her invisible, incompetent, a nuisance. "Perhaps," Marcus continued, his voice honey-coated yet venomous, "you should check with your family members. Sometimes elderly people give money to relatives and then—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And then the memory slips." A hot flush of humiliation crept up Eleanor's neck. The insinuation was clear. She was either lying or senile. Neither option left her any dignity. "My son lives in Seattle," Eleanor replied, her teacher's voice finding some of its old authority. "My daughter in Tampa. Neither has access to my accounts, and I spoke to both of them yesterday." Marcus exchanged another knowing glance with Jessica, who barely suppressed an eye roll. "Mrs. Wilson," he said with exaggerated patience, "banking errors of this type simply don't happen. Our systems are foolproof." "Nothing is foolproof," Eleanor countered, decades of classroom management lending strength to her words. "And I know what I did and didn't do. I did not withdraw that money." By now several customers were openly watching the confrontation. An older gentleman shifted uncomfortably, looking like he wanted to intervene but lacking the courage. A young woman with a toddler frowned at Marcus, clearly disapproving of his tone, but no one spoke up. Marcus lowered his voice, leaning closer to Eleanor. "Mrs. Wilson, do you know how many elderly customers come in here claiming they didn't make withdrawals? It happens every week. And do you know what we find when we investigate?" He didn't wait for her answer. "That they simply forgot. Memory plays tricks as we age." Each word was a precision strike against Eleanor's self-confidence. 43 years of banking at this branch, always careful with her modest accounts, balanced to the penny each month, and now this man was speaking to her as if she were a child. "I want to speak to someone else," Eleanor said, gathering what remained of her composure. "Someone above you." Marcus's practiced smile hardened. "I am the highest authority in this branch, Mrs. Wilson, and I've given you my answer. The withdrawal was processed correctly. If you continue to dispute legitimate transactions, we may need to reconsider whether this bank is the right fit for your unique needs." The threat hung in the air. Eleanor's hands trembled more visibly now, not from age but from a potent mixture of anger and despair. The medication she needed wasn't optional. It kept her heart functioning properly. Without it, the consequences would be severe. "Let me show you something," Marcus said suddenly, motioning for Eleanor to follow him to his desk. His tone suggested this was a generous concession on his part. Eleanor hesitated, then followed. Around the bank, customers and employees pretended not to watch, but eyes followed their every move. At his desk, Marcus made a show of typing in commands, turning the monitor so Eleanor could see it. "This is the withdrawal in question," he said, pointing to the screen. "Thursday, 2:37 p.m., $1,500. The system shows it was processed with your debit card and authenticated with your personal PIN." Eleanor leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "That's impossible. My card never left my purse." Marcus sighed dramatically. "Mrs. Wilson, with all due respect, many seniors become targets for scams. Perhaps you gave your card to someone, a caregiver, a handyman, someone who helped you shop." "I live independently," Eleanor said firmly. "I don't have caregivers. I don't need them." "Not yet, perhaps," Marcus replied, the words landing like a slap. "But clearly, something is amiss with how you're managing your finances." A middle-aged woman at a nearby desk glanced up, frowning slightly at Marcus's tone, but quickly returned to her work when he shot her a warning look. "Now," Marcus continued, turning back to Eleanor, "I'm going to make a suggestion, and I want you to listen carefully." He folded his hands on the desk, the picture of authority. "It might be time to consider adding a responsible family member to your account, someone younger who can help monitor for unusual activity." The suggestion, delivered as if it were a generous offer, cut Eleanor to the quick. After a lifetime of independence, to be told she could no longer manage her own money was the ultimate insult. "No," she said, her voice quavering despite her best efforts. "That's not necessary. What's necessary is for you to investigate this unauthorized withdrawal." Marcus's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Mrs. Wilson, I've explained the situation. The withdrawal shows as authorized in our system, unless you're prepared to file a police report claiming fraud, which I strongly advise against without evidence. There's nothing more to discuss." The woman in sunglasses, who had been moving slowly through the lobby, was now close enough to overhear the conversation. She paused near a brochure display, appearing to read about mortgage rates while clearly listening to the exchange. Eleanor felt tears threatening again and fought them back. She would not cry in this bank. She would not give Marcus that satisfaction. Then, "I'd like to close my account," she said finally, desperation driving her to the last resort. "I'll take what's left and go elsewhere." Marcus didn't bother hiding his condescending smile now. "That's certainly your right, Mrs. Wilson. However, account closures for balances over $5,000 require 48 hours notice. Bank policy." Eleanor's face fell. Another roadblock. Another delay. More days without her medication. "Of course," Marcus added, his voice dripping with false concern, "if you're experiencing some sort of financial hardship, the bank does offer emergency advances to qualified customers." "At what interest rate?" Eleanor asked sharply. Marcus consulted his computer. "For someone of your risk profile, 24.9% APR. The woman in sunglasses stiffened visibly, her hand freezing in the act of reaching for a brochure. "That's highway robbery," Eleanor whispered. "That's the current market rate for customers with limited income," Marcus corrected. "I'm trying to help you, Mrs. Wilson. These are your options." Eleanor stood silent, cornered. Her choices were impossible, except that she had somehow withdrawn money she knew she hadn't. Take a predatory loan or leave without the funds she desperately needed. "I think," said a new voice, calm and authoritative, "that Mrs. Wilson deserves better options than those." All heads turned toward the woman who had removed her sunglasses, revealing a face that was instantly recognizable to everyone in the bank. Marcus's expression froze in mid-condescension. Sandra Bullock stood beside Eleanor's chair, her eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made him shrink back slightly in his seat. "I couldn't help overhearing," Sandra continued, "and I have some questions about how this bank treats its elderly customers." 15 minutes earlier, a black SUV had pulled up outside the bank. Sandra Bullock sat in the back seat, reviewing script notes for her latest film. She was in town shooting Second Chances, a drama about a lawyer who returns to her hometown to defend an old friend. "I'll just be about 20 minutes, Dan," she told her driver. "I need to deposit this check before we head back to set." Dan nodded. "Take your time, Ms. Bullock. We're ahead of schedule today." Sandra slipped on a pair of oversized sunglasses and tucked her hair under a baseball cap, her usual attempt at maintaining a low profile in public. It rarely worked completely, but it sometimes bought her a few minutes of normalcy before the inevitable recognition. As she approached the bank's entrance, Sandra mentally rehearsed her lines for tomorrow's emotional courtroom scene. Her character was defending someone society had written off, fighting against a system designed to favor the powerful. The parallels to her own life weren't lost on her. Using her position to advocate for those who needed support had always been important. To Sandra, the cool air of the bank lobby hit her as she entered, a welcome relief from the warm spring day outside. She took her place in line, observing the room while trying to remain inconspicuous. Old habits from acting school: watch people, study their movements, their expressions, the subtle ways they communicate without words. That's when she first noticed. Eleanor Wilson, the elderly woman, stood at counter 4, her posture gradually collapsing inward as the young teller spoke to her. Even from a distance, Sandra could see the familiar signs of dismissal. The teller barely making eye contact, the impatient gestures, the performative sighs. Sandra had seen this before. Her own grandmother, before she passed, had described similar experiences, how the world seemed to look through her rather than at her after she reached a certain age. "Next, please," called a teller, but Sandra didn't move. Something about the elderly woman's dignified struggle held her attention. She waved the person behind her forward, earning a curious glance but no complaint. When the branch manager approached the elderly woman's counter, Sandra expected things to improve. Managers were supposed to solve problems, to mediate, to make things right. Instead, she watched as the situation deteriorated further. Sandra couldn't hear every word, but the body language told the story. The manager's squared shoulders and forward-leaning posture, the dismissive hand gestures, the elderly woman's increasingly hunched shoulders, the way other customers averted their eyes, pretending not to notice the humiliation playing out before them. It reminded Sandra of a scene they'd filmed last week, her character witnessing an injustice and having to decide whether to get involved or walk away. In the script, her character chose to act. In real life, the choice felt just as clear. Sandra moved closer, pretending to browse brochures about investment opportunities she didn't need. Now she could hear fragments of the conversation. Memory plays tricks as we age. Might be time to consider adding a responsible family member. Risk profile, 24.9% APR. Each condescending remark made Sandra's jaw tighten. She thought of her grandmother, of how she would feel if someone treated her that way. She thought of her own mother, who had taught her that the true measure of a society was how it treated its most vulnerable members. The elderly woman, Eleanor, Sandra had heard the manager call her, was fighting back tears now, her dignity hanging by a thread. The manager, smug in his position of power, seemed almost to be enjoying her distress. Sandra had played many roles in her career. The FBI agent, the astronaut, the reluctant hero forced by circumstances to stand up and fight. But this wasn't a movie set. This was real life, with real consequences. Whatever she did next wouldn't be solved by a scriptwriter's clever dialogue or wrapped up neatly before the credits rolled. For a moment she hesitated. Celebrities who inserted themselves into situations often faced accusations of seeking publicity or overstepping boundaries. Would her presence help or just complicate things further? Then she remembered something. Her mother used to say, "When you see someone drowning, you don't worry about getting your clothes wet." Helena Wilson was drowning, not in water but in humiliation and helplessness. Sandra removed her sunglasses. Decision made. "I think," she said, her voice clear and steady, "that Mrs. Wilson deserves better options than those." The bank fell, silent. She could feel the recognition ripple through the room, the widened eyes, the whispered confirmations, the shocked expressions. But Sandra kept her focus on the manager, whose face had transformed from condescending to startled in an instant. I'm sorry, Ms. Bullock," the manager stammered, rising quickly from his chair. "I didn't realize. Welcome to our branch. How can I assist you today?" Sandra ignored his question, turning instead to Eleanor. "I'm Sandra," she said simply, extending her hand. "Would you mind if I sat with you for a moment?" Eleanor blinked in surprise, clearly struggling to process the sudden appearance of a Hollywood star in the middle of her personal crisis. Of course," she managed, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Sandra sat down, placing herself firmly in Eleanor's corner, both literally and figuratively. She turned to the manager, whose name badge read Marcus Daniels. "Mr. Daniels," she said, her tone professional but unmistakably firm. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation with Mrs. Wilson. It seems there's a discrepancy with her account that's causing her significant distress." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Bullock, I assure you we're handling this situation according to bank protocol. Mrs. Wilson is disputing a withdrawal that our systems show was properly authorized." "I see," Sandra replied. "And your protocol includes suggesting that elderly customers can't trust their own memories, that they should take out loans at predatory interest rates to replace money they know they didn't spend." A flush crept up Marcus's neck. Around the bank, customers had abandoned any pretense of not watching. Some had phones partially raised, though none had yet dared to take photos or videos. "Perhaps," Sandra continued, "we could start by reviewing the situation from the beginning. Mrs. Wilson believes she didn't make this withdrawal, correct?" Eleanor nodded, sitting straighter now. "That's right, I couldn't have. I was at my granddaughter's piano recital at the time they say the withdrawal happened." Sandra turned back to Marcus. "That seems like a solid alibi. I assume the bank has security footage that could verify whether Mrs. Wilson was actually here making this withdrawal?" Marcus swallowed hard. "As I explained to Mrs. Wilson, accessing security footage requires formal procedures. A police report would need to be filed, and you discouraged her from filing one," Sandra finished for him. Interesting approach for someone claiming to follow protocol. The bank was now completely silent, every ear tuned to their conversation. Jessica, the teller who had first dismissed Eleanor, stood frozen at her counter, no longer even pretending to work. Eleanor watched Sandra with a mixture of gratitude and awe, her earlier humiliation giving way to a cautious hope. This stranger, this famous actress, was treating her with more respect in 2 minutes than the bank staff had shown in 2 hours. "Let me be clear, Mr. Daniels," Sandra said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm not leaving this bank until Mrs. Wilson's situation is resolved fairly, and by fairly I mean without assumptions about her memory or competence, based solely on her age." Marcus glanced around nervously, acutely aware of the audience they now had. "Of course, Ms. Bullock. Customer satisfaction is our top priority. Perhaps we could continue this discussion in my office. For privacy?" Sandra looked to Eleanor. "Would you be comfortable with that, Mrs. Wilson?" Eleanor nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "Yes, I think that would be fine." As they stood, to follow Marcus to his office, Sandra noticed the subtle change in Eleanor's posture. Shoulders back, chin higher, eyes clearer. The simple act of being believed, of having someone stand beside her, had already begun to restore what the bank had tried to take from her. Her dignity, what had started as a routine trip to deposit a check, had become something much more significant. Sandra knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The atmosphere in Marcus's office was tense. The branch manager had transformed within seconds, his condescending demeanor replaced by nervous deference as he pulled out a chair for Sandra. "Bullock." The abrupt change wasn't lost on Eleanor, who watched with a mixture of amazement and vindication. "Can I offer you anything? Water? Coffee?" Marcus asked, his voice pitched higher than normal. His eyes darted between Sandra and Eleanor, clearly recalculating every assumption he'd made earlier. "I think what Mrs. Wilson needs is answers, not refreshments," Sandra replied evenly. She sat close to Eleanor, a subtle but clear statement of allegiance. Eleanor smoothed her cardigan, feeling strangely calm now despite the surreal turn of events. "Thank you, Sandra," she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue, addressing this famous woman she'd seen in countless movies as if they were old friends. Marcus cleared his throat, shuffling papers on his desk. "As I was explaining, our systems are quite secure. When a withdrawal is processed, multiple verification steps—" "Let's back up," Sandra interrupted. "Mrs. Wilson says she was at her granddaughter's recital when this withdrawal supposedly happened. That's a fact we can verify, correct?" Marcus's smile tightened. "Well, technically, yes or no, Mr. Daniels? Can we verify whether Mrs. Wilson was physically present in this bank at 2:37 p.m. last Thursday?" The directness of the question left no room for evasion. Marcus swallowed hard. "Yes, our security cameras would show who made the withdrawal." "Perfect," Sandra said. "Let's review that footage right now." Outside Marcus's glass-walled office, the bank's regular operations had all but ceased. Employees whispered to each other, stealing glances at the unexpected celebrity in their midst. Customers lingered, abandoning their original banking tasks to witness what was unfolding. "Ms. Bullock," Marcus began carefully, "I apologize, but accessing security footage isn't something we typically do on the spot. There are procedures, authorizations." "I understand procedures, Mr. Daniels," Sandra replied. "I work in an industry full of them, but procedures exist to serve people, not the other way around. Mrs. Wilson has been a customer here for over 40 years. Surely that earns her the courtesy of a proper investigation." Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced down, eyes widening slightly at the message. "Excuse me one moment," he said, standing abruptly. "I need to consult with our security team." As he stepped outside, Eleanor turned to Sandra. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You don't even know me." Sandra's expression softened. "My grandmother lived to be 92, she said, sharp as a tack until the very end. But the older she got, the more people talked to her like she was a child. Doctors, store clerks, even family. Sometimes it broke my heart." She paused, meeting Eleanor's gaze. "I couldn't help her then the way I wished, but I can help you now." Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside Marcus's office, the commotion was growing. Employees huddled in small groups, smartphones in hand. Through the glass walls, Eleanor could see fingers pointing, heads nodding in their direction. "I think your cover is blown," Eleanor said with a small smile. Sandra laughed quietly. "It usually doesn't take this long. The hat and sunglasses only work in movies. The door opened again and Marcus returned, followed by a heavy-set man in a security uniform and a nervous-looking woman in a sharp business suit. "Mrs. Wilson, Ms. Bullock," Marcus said, his voice strained. "This is Patricia Alvarez, our regional director, and Jim Conroy, head of security." Patricia stepped forward immediately, hand extended toward Sandra. "Ms. Bullock, it's an honor. I'm a huge fan of your work." Sandra stood, shaking the offered hand, but quickly redirecting the conversation. "Thank you, Ms. Alvarez. I appreciate your joining us. We were just discussing the importance of reviewing the security footage from last Thursday to resolve Mrs. Wilson's situation." Patricia's smile faltered slightly. She shot Marcus a quick, sharp glance before composing herself. "Of course. Customer satisfaction is our highest priority at First National. Mr. Conroy is prepared to access that footage immediately." The security head nodded, moving to the computer on Marcus's desk. "I'll need to log into the secure server," he explained, fingers tapping quickly on the keyboard. Eleanor watched in astonishment. After hours of being stonewalled, denied, and dismissed, suddenly the bank was bending over backward to accommodate her request. The only difference was the woman sitting beside her, a woman whose fame had transformed her from nuisance to priority in an instant. The irony wasn't lost on Sandra either. "Amazing how quickly procedures can be adapted when necessary," she observed, her gaze fixed on Marcus, who had the decency to look embarrassed. Outside the office, the crowd had grown. Bank customers pressed closer to the glass, many with phones now openly recording. Employees struggled to maintain order while stealing glances themselves. "This might be a problem," Patricia murmured, noticing the gathering audience. "I agree," Sandra replied. "Mrs. Wilson deserves privacy during this process. Perhaps we should move to a more secure location." Patricia nodded quickly. "Yes, excellent suggestion. We have a conference room in the back. No windows, complete privacy." They gathered their things. Sandra placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm. "Are you doing okay with all this?" Eleanor smiled. "Better than okay. For the first time today, I feel like someone's listening." The group moved through the bank, past curious stares and whispers. Eleanor, who had entered the building feeling small and insignificant, now walked with her head high beside one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses. In the conference room, Jim Conroy connected his laptop to a large screen mounted on the wall. "Our security system archives footage for 90 days, he explained. "I'm pulling up last Thursday at 2:30 p.m., which should show us a few minutes before the transaction in question." The screen flickered to life, showing the bank lobby from multiple camera angles. Jim selected the view of the teller windows and fast-forwarded to 2:35 p.m. Everyone leaned forward, watching intently as the timestamp approached 2:37. At exactly that moment, a figure approached counter 3, not counter 4, where Jessica normally worked. The person wore a baseball cap pulled low and kept their head down. "Freeze that," Sandra said sharply. Jim paused the footage. The figure at the counter was approximately Eleanor's height, but was clearly not Eleanor. "That's not me," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly strong. "I told you I wasn't here." Marcus's face had drained of color. Patricia Alvarez leaned closer to the screen, her expression grave. "Can you zoom in?" she asked. Jim manipulated the controls, enlarging the image. Though the quality was somewhat grainy, it was now obvious that the person making the withdrawal was at least 30 years younger than Eleanor, and appeared to be male, despite being similar in stature. "Oh my God," Patricia whispered. Eleanor turned to Marcus, tears of vindication in her eyes. I told you I didn't make that withdrawal." Marcus couldn't meet her gaze. Patricia stepped in, her voice now entirely professional. "Mrs. Wilson, on behalf of First National Bank, I want to extend our sincerest apologies. Clearly a serious security breach has occurred." Sandra's expression was cool as she regarded the bank officials. "A security breach is concerning, certainly, but equally concerning is how Mrs. Wilson was treated when she tried to report it. The assumptions made about her competence, the dismissal of her concerns, the attempts to make her doubt her own memory." Patricia nodded gravely. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Bullock. The customer service failures here are inexcusable." Outside, the commotion had grown. Through the closed door they could hear excited voices, the unmistakable buzz that follows celebrity recognition. "It appears," Sandra said, glancing toward the door, "that we've created quite a situation out there." Patricia sighed. "Yes. News travels fast." She turned to Eleanor, her expression sincere. "Mrs. Wilson, I promise you we will get to the bottom of this fraud. Your funds will be returned immediately along with compensation for your distress. And I assure you," she added, with a pointed look at Marcus, "there will be consequences for how your case was handled." Eleanor nodded, still processing the vindication she felt seeing the evidence on screen. After hours of being made to feel like she was losing her mind, the truth was finally acknowledged. "Thank you," she said simply, then turned to Sandra. "And thank you if you hadn't been here," Sandra smiled warmly. "But I was. And we're not done yet." "We're not done yet." Sandra's words hung in the air with quiet determination. What had begun as a chance encounter was rapidly evolving into something more significant. Eleanor watched as Sandra turned back to the security footage, studying it with the focused intensity of someone who had spent decades analyzing scenes. "I'd like to see more," Sandra said, gesturing toward the screen. "Can we look at other days? Specifically, check if this same person has made other withdrawals from other accounts." Jim Conroy exchanged an uncertain glance with Patricia Alvarez. "That would require accessing multiple customer accounts. There are privacy considerations, there are fraud considerations," Sandra countered firmly. "If someone is systematically targeting your elderly customers, that's a pattern you need to identify." Patricia nodded slowly. "She's right, Jim. This could be more widespread than we realize." She turned to Marcus, who had been uncharacteristically silent. "Mr. Daniels, how many elderly customers have reported unauthorized withdrawals in the past 3 months?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I don't have those figures handy." "Then get them," Patricia said sharply. "Now!" As Marcus hurried out, Eleanor leaned toward Sandra. "Do you really think there are others?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Sandra admitted. "But the person on that footage knew exactly what they were doing. They kept their face hidden, chose a different teller than the one you normally use. This wasn't random opportunism." Patricia pulled out her phone. "I'm calling our fraud department and getting them on this immediately." She stepped away to make the call, her voice low but urgent. Jim continued working at the computer, pulling up additional footage. "I can search by transaction type and amount," he explained. "Looking for withdrawals over $1,000 made in person during the past month." Sandra nodded. "Good. And check if the same physical description matches. Small stature, baseball cap, keeping." Their head down, Eleanor watched in amazement as Sandra effortlessly took control of the investigation. The actress had spoken about researching a role as a fraud investigator, but her confident command of the situation suggested more than just memorized lines. "When I was preparing for The Net years ago," Sandra explained, noticing Eleanor's expression, "I spent weeks with cybersecurity experts. Some things stick with you. The patterns of fraud haven't changed much, even if the technology has." Outside the conference room, the commotion in the bank lobby had grown. Through the closed door, they could hear raised voices and the unmistakable sounds of a crowd gathering. Patricia returned, slipping her phone into her pocket. "Our fraud team is on their way. They'll be here within the hour." She glanced toward the door. "But we have another situation developing. Word has spread that Sandra Bullock is in the building. We have media vans pulling up outside." Sandra grimaced slightly. "That was inevitable, I suppose." "Do you want to leave through the back?" Patricia asked. "We have a private exit." Sandra looked at Eleanor, then shook her head. "No. I think it's important that I stay. Mrs. Wilson's situation may not be unique, and public attention might help others come forward." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude. This woman, this celebrity who could have easily extricated herself from the situation, was choosing to stand by her, to use her fame to shine a light on what might be a much larger injustice. "I've found something," Jim announced suddenly, his eyes fixed on the screen. 3 similar withdrawals in the past month, all from customers over 70, all for amounts between $1,000 and $2,000. Patricia leaned over his shoulder, her expression darkening. Can you pull up that footage? Jim nodded, typing rapidly. The screen split into 4 quadrants, showing different withdrawal transactions. In each one, a figure in a baseball cap approached a teller window. Head down, minimal interaction. It's the same person, Sandra said quietly. Look at the body language, the way they stand. That's our fraudster. Marcus returned, clutching a printout. His face was pale. I've pulled the records you asked for. In the past 3 months, we've had 17 elderly customers report unauthorized withdrawals. All were dismissed as user error. 17. Patricia's voice was sharp with disbelief. And no one noticed this pattern? Marcus avoided her gaze. The complaints were handled individually. Standard procedure is to assume customer error unless proven otherwise. Standard procedure, Sandra repeated, the words heavy with disapproval. So 17 elderly people were told they were confused, forgetful, or incompetent, just like Mrs. Wilson was today. Eleanor felt a deep sadness, thinking of others like herself who had been dismissed and humiliated. How many just gave up? She wondered aloud. How many couldn't afford to lose that money but were too ashamed to keep fighting after being treated the way I was? The room fell silent, the weight of her questions hanging in the air. Even Patricia seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Sandra stood, her decision made. We need to contact each of those 17 people immediately, and we need to review all footage of the fraudulent withdrawals to identify this person. Ms. Bullock, Patricia began cautiously, while we deeply appreciate your concern, this is now a matter for our security team and potentially law enforcement. I understand, Sandra interrupted gently but firmly. And I'll gladly step aside once I know that every victim will be treated with dignity and fully compensated for both their financial losses and the emotional distress caused by the bank's response. Patricia nodded slowly. That's fair. I give you my word that we'll handle this properly from here on out. And what about the employees who dismissed these customers? Eleanor asked, finding her voice again. What happens to them? All eyes turned to Marcus, who seemed to shrink under their collective gaze. There will be a full review of how these cases were handled, Patricia assured them. Anyone who failed to follow proper protocols or treated customers disrespectfully will face appropriate consequences. Just then, the door opened, and Jessica, the teller who had first dismissed Eleanor, stepped halfway into the room, her expression anxious. Excuse me, she said timidly. There's someone here who says she had the same thing happen to her, an unauthorized withdrawal. She saw Mrs. Wilson and Miss Bullock, and she wants to speak with you. Sandra and Eleanor exchanged glances. Send her in, Sandra said without hesitation. A frail woman in her 80s entered, leaning heavily on a cane. I heard what was happening, she said, her voice quavering slightly. Last month, they took $200 from my account. They told me I must have forgotten making the withdrawal, but I knew I hadn't. After today, I thought maybe someone would finally believe me. Eleanor moved to the woman's side, helping her to a chair. We believe you, she said firmly, and we're going to make this right. Sandra turned to Patricia, her expression resolute. This is bigger than we thought. These aren't isolated incidents. It's a systematic targeting of your most vulnerable customers. Patricia's professional demeanor cracked slightly, genuine concern showing through. I promise you, we will get to the bottom of this, but with the media outside, this could become very public very quickly. Good, Sandra replied. Sometimes public accountability is exactly what's needed. Jim's computer pinged with an alert. The fraud team is accessing the system remotely now, he reported. They flagged another dozen suspicious withdrawals from elderly account holders. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. What had begun as one woman's fight to be heard had uncovered what appeared to be an organized scheme targeting senior citizens. Sandra placed a reassuring hand on Eleanor's shoulder. You did this, she said quietly. By refusing to be dismissed, by insisting on the truth, you've opened the door for others to find justice too. Eleanor straightened in her chair, a new resolve in her eyes. What do we do next? Sandra smiled. Now we make sure everyone gets heard. Every single person who was told they were just confused or forgetful. Every person who was made to feel less than because of their age. She turned to Patricia. "And we don't stop until we find out who's behind this and how they're getting away with it." Outside, the cameras were gathering, the story already beginning to spread. Inside, an unlikely alliance of an elderly teacher and a Hollywood star had just taken control of a situation that would soon shake an entire banking system to its core. Within an hour, the conference room had transformed into an impromptu command center. 2 representatives from the bank's corporate fraud division had arrived, along with a detective from the financial crimes unit of the local police department. Printouts of account statements and transaction logs covered the table, and the large screen now displayed a timeline of suspicious withdrawals. Sandra sat beside Eleanor, both of them watching as the investigation unfolded with remarkable speed. What would have been impossible hours earlier, accessing records, reviewing footage, connecting cases, was now happening with urgent efficiency. "So far we've identified 29 potential victims," said Rebecca Chen, the lead fraud investigator, "all over the age of 70, all reporting unauthorized withdrawals, all initially dismissed by branch staff." The detective, a middle-aged man named Harris, shook his head as he reviewed the pattern. "The amounts are carefully chosen," he observed. "Large enough to be worth stealing, but not so large that they'd trigger automatic fraud alerts. Between $1,000 and $2,000 each time. And always withdrawn as cash," Sandra noted, pointing to the transaction details. "Untraceable once it leaves the bank." Patricia Alvarez had remained in the room, her initial corporate polish giving way to genuine concern as the scope of the fraud became clear. "What I don't understand is how they're accessing these accounts. These aren't electronic transfers or card skimming. These are in-person withdrawals requiring ID and PIN verification." Eleanor, who had been quietly absorbing all the information, spoke up. "When was the first withdrawal you've identified?" Rebecca consulted her notes. "Approximately 3 months. House April 15th. And what changed at the bank around that time?" Eleanor asked, her decades of teaching experience evident in her measured, thoughtful questioning. The room fell silent as everyone considered her question. Marcus, who had been relegated to a corner chair, cleared his throat nervously. We implemented a new streamlined verification system for tellers to speed up transaction times." All eyes turned to him. "Explain," Patricia commanded. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "The old system required tellers to visually confirm ID for all withdrawals over $500. The new system only requires PIN entry for amounts under $2,000. Visual ID verification is only mandatory for amounts over $2,000. Sandra's eyes narrowed. "So someone with just a debit card and PIN could withdraw up to $1,999 without showing identification?" "In theory, yes," Marcus admitted. "But they'd still need both the physical card and the PIN number." Detective Harris leaned forward. "And when did you announce this policy change?" "We sent notices to all customers in their March statements," Marcus replied. "March statements," Eleanor repeated slowly, "which most people would barely glance at." "But someone did more than glance. Someone saw an opportunity," Sandra nodded, connecting the dots. "Someone inside the bank. Someone with access to account information." Rebecca was already typing rapidly on her laptop. "I'm running a cross-reference of employee schedules against the fraudulent withdrawal dates and times." The tension in the room thickened. If this was an inside job, everyone became a potential suspect. "While we wait for that," Detective Harris said, "let's review what we know about the person making these withdrawals." From the security footage, they're approximately 5'4" to 5'6", slight build, always wearing a baseball cap pulled low. "Could be a man or woman," Sandra observed. "The baggy clothes make it hard to tell." "Whoever it is," Patricia said grimly, "they know our systems well enough to stay just under the radar. They know exactly how much to take without triggering additional verification." Eleanor had been studying the map of victims pinned to the conference room wall. Each red dot represented a person like her, someone who had been made to question their own memory, to doubt themselves, to feel the particular sting of age-based discrimination. "They're all from this branch," she noted. "All the victims, not from other branches in the city." Rebecca looked up from her computer. "You're right. The fraud is localized to this location, which means our suspect pool is limited to employees at this branch," Detective Harris concluded. How many staff members work here? 23, Patricia answered. 15 tellers, 4 financial advisors, 3 assistant managers, and Marcus. The computer beeped. Rebecca's eyes widened as she reviewed the results of her search. I've got a match. On 16 of the 29 fraudulent withdrawals, 1 employee was on shift, but not directly involved in the transactions. Who? Patricia demanded. Rebecca hesitated, glancing at Marcus. Kevin Lowell, assistant manager, works directly under Mr. Daniels. Marcus paled visibly. Kevin? That's impossible. He's been with us for 5 years. Model employee. Sandra turned to Jim Conroy. Do you have footage of this Kevin at work? His regular movements around the branch? Jim nodded, fingers flying across the keyboard. The screen changed to show a young man in his early 30s, well-dressed, moving confidently through the bank. Lobby. Height approximately 5'5", Detective Harris noted, measuring against the doorframe in the footage. Build matches are suspect. But how would he get the cards and pins? Patricia asked. Even an assistant manager doesn't have access to pin numbers. Eleanor had been watching quietly, her teacher's mind putting the pieces together. He wouldn't need access, she said softly. He'd just need to watch. The room turned to her. Shoulder. Surfing, she explained. My grandson warned me about it years ago. Someone watches over your shoulder when you enter your PIN. In a crowded bank, who would notice an assistant manager standing nearby, seemingly helping another customer or checking something? Detective Harris nodded slowly. And once he has the PIN, he could create a duplicate card. Card skimming technology is readily available, Rebecca confirmed. With a small device, he could capture card data whenever he handled a customer's card. And he would specifically target elderly customers, Sandra added, the picture becoming clearer. Those he assumed wouldn't notice the missing funds, or who might be dismissed if they did complain. People like me, Eleanor said quietly. People easily written off as confused or forgetful. The weight of this realization settled over the room. The fraud was calculating not just in its technical execution, but in its choice of victims, people society often rendered invisible, whose concerns could be brushed aside with paternalistic condescension. Where is Kevin now? Detective Harris asked, already reaching for his phone. Marcus glanced at his watch. He should be on shift. He works Tuesdays until closing. Patricia picked up the conference room phone. I'll have security locate him immediately. But before she could dial, the door opened. Jessica stood there, her expression panicked. Miss Alvarez, Kevin just left. He said he was feeling sick and needed to go home, but I saw him looking at the conference room before he left. He was asking what was going on. Detective Harris was immediately on his feet. He knows we're onto him. Did he leave on foot or by car? Car, Jessica replied. The Silver Accord in Space 8. The detective was already calling for backup, requesting officers to Kevin's home address and alerting Highway Patrol to watch for his vehicle. The energy in the room had shifted from investigation to urgent action. Rebecca was securing electronic evidence, while Jim pulled all relevant security footage. Patricia was on the phone with the bank's legal team, preparing for what would likely become a major case. In the midst of this flurry, Sandra turned to Eleanor. Are you doing okay? This is a lot to process. Eleanor nodded slowly. I am. Better than okay, actually. She gestured to the room full of people now working diligently to uncover the truth. For the first time since I walked into this bank today, I feel like I matter. Like what happened to me matters, Sandra smiled, squeezing Eleanor's hand gently. It always mattered, and you helped expose something that was hurting a lot of people. That's no small thing. Outside the conference room, the bank lobby had been closed to new customers, the growing crowd of journalists and curious onlookers held at bay by security guards. The story was already spreading. Sandra Bullock uncovers bank fraud targeting elderly customers. But the real story, Sandra knew, wasn't about her celebrity intervention. It was about Eleanor Wilson, who refused to accept being dismissed, and in doing so, revealed a deeper problem that had been hiding in plain sight. Pottis, what happens now? Eleanor asked, watching the detective coordinate with patrol units. Now, Sandra replied, We make sure justice happens, for you and for everyone else who was victimized twice, first by the fraud, and then by the system that refused to believe them. News travels fast in the digital age, but it travels at lightning speed when a Hollywood star is involved. By early evening, the story of Sandra Bullock uncovering bank fraud had spread across social media and local news channels. The bank's parking lot was now filled with news vans, their satellite dishes stretching skyward like metal flowers seeking the sun. Inside, the bank's large community room, normally used for financial planning seminars, had been hastily repurposed. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, a table with water pitchers set at the front. One by one, elderly customers identified as potential victims arrived, many accompanied by concerned family members. Some walked with canes or walkers, others moved with the careful deliberation that comes with age. All carried expressions of mingled hope and skepticism. Eleanor sat in the front row, her back straight, her eyes clear. The past several hours had transformed her, from victim to advocate, from dismissed elder to respected voice. Beside her, Sandra remained, having declined multiple opportunities to slip away through the bank's rear exit. "You don't have to stay," Eleanor had told her earlier. "You've already done more than enough." Sandra had smiled, shaking her head. "I'm seeing this through. Besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "I think I'm learning more for my role from this than I would from a dozen research interviews." Patricia Alvarez stood at the front of the room, hands clasped before her. The regional director's polished corporate demeanor had softened, revealing flashes of genuine empathy as she addressed the assembled seniors. "First and foremost," she began, "I want to apologize to each of you, not just for the fraud that appears to have targeted your accounts, but for how your concerns were dismissed when you reported it. That was unacceptable." Murmurs rippled through the room. One elderly man called out, "My son thought I was losing my mind, told me I needed to see a doctor about my memory." A white-haired woman nodded vigorously. "My daughter wanted to take control of my finances, said I couldn't be trusted anymore." Each comment revealed the deeper damage done, not just financial loss, but assaults on dignity, independence, family trust. "I understand," Patricia acknowledged, "and while we can reimburse your financial losses, we know the emotional toll has been significant. That's why, in addition to full restitution, First National will be offering compensation for the distress caused." Sandra stood, moving to join Patricia at the front. The room quieted immediately, attention shifting to the actress. "If I may," Sandra said, her voice gentle but firm, "what happened here reveals something we need to address as a society. When did we decide that age makes someone less credible, less deserving of respect, less worthy of being believed?" Eleanor watched Sandra with growing admiration. This wasn't a performance, it was genuine conviction. "Each of you," Sandra continued, gesturing to the room of seniors, "has decades of experience managing your lives and your finances. You've raised families, built careers, navigated challenges most of us can't imagine. Yet somehow, when you reported something amiss with your accounts, the default assumption wasn't, 'let's investigate,' but, 'they must be confused.'" Heads nodded throughout the room. Eyes that had been downcast with shame now lifted, connecting with others who had shared the same experience. Detective Harris, who had been standing near the door, stepped forward. "We have an update on the investigation. Kevin Lowell was apprehended 30 minutes ago attempting to cross the state line. He had over $10,000 in cash in his possession, along with equipment for creating duplicate debit cards." A collective sigh of relief filled the room, followed by scattered applause. Eleanor reached for Sandra's hand, squeezing it tightly, the confirmation that they had been right, that this wasn't mass confusion or coincidence, but deliberate criminal action. Felt like vindication. "While this is encouraging news," Patricia added, "we recognize that the failure wasn't just one individual's actions. It was systemic, a culture that allowed complaints from elderly customers to be routinely dismissed. That changes today." She outlined a series of immediate policy changes. Mandatory investigation of all disputed transactions, regardless of customer age, additional security measures for elderly account holders who requested them, and, most significantly, age sensitivity, training for all staff. As Patricia spoke, Eleanor observed the other seniors in the room. Their expressions were transforming, from victims seeking redress to advocates demanding change. What had begun as individual humiliations was becoming a collective stand for dignity. An elderly man with a veteran's cap raised his hand. "What about the employees who dismissed us? The ones who made us feel foolish for even questioning our statements?" Patricia hesitated, corporate caution momentarily reasserting itself. "We'll be conducting a thorough review of how each case was handled." "Not good enough," the man replied firmly. "We deserve to know that those people won't do this to anyone else." Sandra nodded in agreement. "Accountability matters, not to punish, but to ensure real change." Eleanor stood then, surprising herself. "May I say something?" she asked. All eyes turned to her. The woman whose refusal to be silenced had started it all. "I taught elementary school for 40 years, she began, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the room. "And one thing I learned is that real change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from education, from understanding." She turned to face her fellow seniors. "Yes, we were wronged. Yes, there should be consequences. But what matters most is that this doesn't happen to anyone else. That requires more than firing people. It requires changing how society views aging." A thoughtful silence followed her words. "Mrs. Wilson is right," Sandra said finally. "And that's why I'd like to propose something." She turned to Patricia. "The film I'm currently working on includes themes of justice and accountability. With your permission, I'd like our production company to document this case, not as exploitation, but as education, to show how age discrimination can enable crime and how powerful it is when people stand together against it." Patricia's eyes widened at the unexpected proposal. "That would be quite extraordinary. I'd need to consult with our legal team, of course, but speaking personally, I think it could be tremendously valuable." Discussion erupted around the room, the energy shifting from anger to possibility. Seniors who had arrived feeling victimized were now engaged in passionate conversation about how their experiences could help others. Eleanor observed the transformation with quiet satisfaction. "Look at that," she murmured to Sandra. "A few hours ago, most of these people probably felt invisible. Now they're planning how to change the world." Sandra smiled, watching the animated discussions unfold. That's what happens when people stand together, when they refuse to be dismissed. Outside, the media waited, hungry for statements and sound bites. Inside, something more powerful was building. A community formed through shared injustice, now united in purpose. As the meeting continued, an elderly woman approached Eleanor, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said simply, clasping Eleanor's hand. "If you hadn't spoken up, I might never have found the courage to do the same." Eleanor nodded, understanding completely. "We all need someone to believe in us sometimes," she replied, glancing at Sandra. "And then we can start believing in ourselves again." The power of standing together wasn't just in the strength of numbers, Eleanor realized. It was in the restoration of dignity that came from collective affirmation, from transforming your word against theirs into our truth against injustice. 1 week later, Eleanor Wilson sat in her modest living room, watching the morning news with a cup of tea. Her heart medication, purchased with the funds that had been promptly restored to her account, sat on the side table, a tangible reminder of all that had transpired. The news anchor's voice filled the room. In continuing coverage of what's being called the Elder Fraud case, First National Bank announced sweeping changes to their security protocols and customer service policies. The bank has also created a special compensation fund for the 34 victims identified in the scheme. Eleanor smiled quietly. 34 victims, 5 more than they had initially found. Individuals who had been too embarrassed or discouraged to report their losses until the story broke. Each one now vindicated, their accounts restored, their dignity affirmed. The doorbell rang. Eleanor rose carefully, straightening her cardigan before opening the door to find Sandra Bullock standing on her porch, carrying a small potted orchid. "I was in the neighborhood," Sandra said with a warm smile. "Thought I'd check in on my favorite banking whistleblower." Eleanor laughed, welcoming her inside. In the week since their extraordinary encounter, A genuine friendship had formed between the elderly teacher and the Hollywood star, an unlikely connection bridging generations and lifestyles. "You're just in time," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the television. "They're covering the press conference." On screen, Patricia Alvarez stood before a bank of microphones, flanked by the bank's CEO and members of the board. Her expression was solemn as she detailed the findings of their internal investigation and the changes being implemented. "Following a comprehensive review, we have terminated the employment of 4 individuals who failed to properly investigate fraud claims from elderly customers," Patricia announced. "Additionally, Marcus Daniels has resigned from his position as branch manager." Sandra settled onto the sofa beside Eleanor. "Justice at work," she observed quietly. "Not just punishment," Eleanor clarified, echoing her words from the community meeting. "Education, too." She was right. The press conference continued with Patricia outlining the bank's new mandatory training program, developed in consultation with elder advocacy groups, to address age-based bias in financial services. "Most significantly," Patricia continued, "on screen, we are establishing an elder banking advocate position at each of our branches. These specially trained staff members will work specifically with older customers to ensure their concerns are heard and addressed promptly." Eleanor nodded with satisfaction. "That was your idea," she reminded Sandra. "Inspired by you," Sandra countered. "I just suggested the structure. The need was obvious from your experience." The news segment shifted to show Kevin Lowell being escorted into the courthouse, his face partially hidden behind a folder. The reporter's voiceover explained that he faced multiple felony charges of fraud, theft, and exploitation of the elderly. "His lawyer is apparently trying to negotiate a plea deal," Sandra informed Eleanor. "The evidence is overwhelming." Detective Harris said they found notebooks with account numbers, pins, even notes about which customers might be easily confused. His words. Eleanor's expression darkened momentarily. "The deliberate targeting makes it worse somehow. Too specifically, choose people you think won't be believed." Sandra nodded. "It's predatory in the most calculated way, but he didn't count on someone like you, someone who refused to be dismissed." The news shifted to a human interest segment, showing elderly customers at First National Bank being assisted by the newly appointed elder banking advocates, staff members wearing distinctive blue lapel pins that identified their special role. "I never expected any of this," Eleanor admitted. "When I walked into that bank last week, I just wanted my money back. I never imagined it would lead to policy changes, new positions, training programs." "That's how meaningful change often happens," Sandra observed. "One person stands firm, then another joins them, and suddenly what seemed impossible becomes inevitable." Eleanor's phone chimed with a text message. She glanced at it, smiling. "That's Margaret. She was victim number 12. She's inviting me to join the Elder Advisory Council." Following the fraud exposure, the bank had established a council of elderly customers to provide ongoing input on policies and services. What had begun as crisis management was evolving into genuine institutional change. "Will you do it?" Sandra asked. Eleanor nodded. "I think I will. After 40 years of teaching, I thought my days of making a difference were behind me. It feels good to know that's not true." Sandra's phone rang. She checked it, then declined the call with an apologetic smile. "The production team. They can wait a bit." True to her word, Sandra's production company was developing a documentary about the case. Not a sensationalized account of celebrity heroism, but a thoughtful examination of how age discrimination creates vulnerability and how listening to marginalized voices can transform systems. "They found footage of you, Sandra mentioned. "From your teaching days. A local news piece from the 90s about your innovative reading program." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Goodness, I'd forgotten about that. They interviewed me when my students won that literacy competition." "You were just as formidable then as you are now," Sandra said with a grin. "No wonder your students adored you." The conversation was interrupted by another ring, this time Eleanor's doorbell. She opened it to find a delivery person holding an elaborate flower arrangement. "Eleanor Wilson." The delivery person confirmed. Eleanor accepted the flowers, reading the attached card aloud. From all of us at First National Bank's Elder Advocacy Council, thank you for your courage. You made a difference. Tears pricked her eyes as she set the flowers on her coffee table. It's strange, she said softly. A week ago I felt so small in that bank, so insignificant, and now they're naming advocacy positions inspired by your stand, Sandra finished. That's the power of refusing to be silenced. Outside, life in Eleanor's quiet neighborhood continued as usual. Children rode bikes, neighbors walked dogs, mail carriers made their rounds. But inside this modest home, two women from vastly different worlds sat together in the shared understanding that justice, when it finally arrives, transforms not just situations, but people. The regional director called me yesterday. Eleanor said, "They want me to speak at the training session for the new elder banking advocates, to share my experience." Sandra beamed. Perfect. No one could do it better. I think I'll talk about dignity, Eleanor mused. About how being dismissed because of my age was almost worse than losing the money. About how we need to see older people as individuals with valid experiences, not as stereotypes. That's exactly what they need to hear, Sandra agreed. And exactly who they need to hear it from. The morning news program had moved on to other stories, politics, weather, sports, but the change sparked by their unlikely partnership continued to ripple outward. In courtrooms and corporate boardrooms, in training sessions and policy manuals, the message was clear. Dignity has no age limit, and justice requires listening to every voice. "What about you?" Eleanor asked. "Your film wraps next week, doesn't it then back to Hollywood?" Sandra nodded. "For a while, but I'll be back for the documentary interviews and," she added with a smile, "to check on my friend." The word friend hung in the air between them, unexpected, genuine, transcending the circumstances of their meeting. What had begun as chance and grown through crisis had become something neither woman had anticipated, a connection bridging. Fame and obscurity, youth and age, that had changed them both. Outside Eleanor's window, the first leaves of autumn were beginning to turn, a season of change, appropriately enough for a story that had started with one woman's refusal to be dismissed and ended with justice not just served, but transformed. 3 months after the events at First National Bank, a crisp December morning found Eleanor Wilson adjusting her scarf as she prepared to address the audience. The hotel conference room was filled to capacity. Bankers, financial regulators, elder care advocates, and reporters all gathered for the first national summit on elder financial security. In the front row sat Sandra Bullock, who had flown in specifically for this event despite her busy filming schedule. Their eyes met briefly, and Sandra gave Eleanor an encouraging nod. "Good morning," Eleanor began, her teacher's voice still strong and clear at 78. "My name is Eleanor Wilson, and 3 months ago I walked into a bank to report money missing from my account. I was dismissed, humiliated, and told that my memory couldn't be trusted. Today I stand before you as the chair of the newly formed National Elder Financial Protection Alliance." Applause filled the room. What had begun as one woman's stand against injustice had catalyzed a movement that was changing banking practices across the country. "The story you may have heard about Sandra Bullock coming to my rescue is true but incomplete," Eleanor continued. "Yes, Sandra's presence forced people to listen, but the real story is about what happens when we fail to see the humanity in each other, when we reduce people to stereotypes based on their age." From the podium, Eleanor could see the faces of other First National 34, as the victims had come to be known. Many had traveled from across the state to be here, forming an unexpected community bound by shared experience and purpose. Following the exposure of fraud at First National Bank, something remarkable happened, Eleanor explained. Other banks began reviewing their own practices. Other elderly customers found the courage to question unusual transactions. What happened to me, what happened to us, was not isolated. It was merely the visible tip of a much larger problem. The statistics Eleanor shared were sobering. Elder financial abuse cost Americans more than $3 billion annually, with much of it unreported due to shame, fear, or exactly the kind of dismissal she had experienced. "But statistics don't tell the human story," she said. "Behind each number is someone like me, someone whose dignity was violated twice, first by the criminal who took their money, and then by the system that refused to believe them. As Eleanor spoke, slides appeared on the screen behind her, photographs of the First National 34 not as victims but as advocates, Margaret teaching a financial literacy class for seniors, Howard consulting with bank security experts on new verification protocols, Josephine testifying before state legislators on strengthened elder protection laws. The documentary that Ms. Bullock's production company has created, premiering tonight on National Public Television, tells our stories, Eleanor continued. Not just the fraud itself, but the journey from dismissal to empowerment. Sandra smiled from the front row. The documentary, titled Invisible, Elder Fraud and the Cost of Dismissal, had already won acclaim at several film festivals. More importantly, it had sparked conversations in community centers, retirement homes and bank boardrooms across the nation. First National Bank has become a model of transformation, Eleanor acknowledged. Their Elder Banking Advocate program has been adopted by 6 major banking chains. Their security protocols have been endorsed by federal regulators, but perhaps most significantly, they recognize that the problem wasn't just one criminal employee. It was a culture that made his crimes possible. Patricia Alvarez, now promoted to Executive Vice President of Community Banking, nodded from her seat in the audience. The bank's response, moving beyond damage control to genuine reform, had turned a potential public relations disaster into a showcase of corporate responsibility. Kevin Lowell will serve 8 years in prison for his crimes, Eleanor noted, referencing the former assistant manager whose plea deal had included full cooperation with investigators. But punishment alone doesn't create change. Education does, policy does, and most importantly, listening does. As Eleanor continued her address, she knew that across the country, dozens of other Kevin Lowells had been identified and stopped, fraudsters who had counted on seniors not being believed, not being heard, not being taken seriously. The most profound impact of what happened that day isn't measured in dollars restored or criminals convicted, Eleanor said, her voice softening. It's measured in dignity preserved, in voices heard, in the simple revolutionary act of treating older adults as full and equal citizens whose experiences matter. She gestured toward Sandra. We often think it takes a celebrity to make a difference. And yes, Sandra's presence that day changed everything, but the real power wasn't in her fame. It was in her willingness to listen, to believe, to stand beside someone society had deemed dismissible. Sandra blinked rapidly, visibly moved by Eleanor's words. The lasting impact of our story isn't just about banking, Eleanor continued. It's about how we see aging in America. It's about challenging the subtle and not so subtle ways we devalue people as they grow older. It's about recognizing that with age comes not just vulnerability, but wisdom, experience, and perspective that our society desperately needs. As Eleanor concluded her remarks, the applause was immediate and sustained. She made her way carefully back to her seat beside Sandra, who enveloped her in a warm hug. Powerful stuff, Professor, Sandra whispered, using the nickname she'd given Eleanor after learning of her teaching career. The summit continued throughout the day. Panels on technology solutions, legislative initiatives, cross-generational, education programs. Eleanor participated actively, her perspective sought and valued by experts with advanced degrees and decades in financial services. During the afternoon break, Eleanor and Sandra found a quiet corner in the hotel lobby. I received another 14 interview requests this morning, Eleanor said, shaking her head in amazement. CNN, NPR, The Wall Street Journal. Sandra laughed. Better get used to it. You're the new face of elder advocacy. Eleanor adjusted her glasses thoughtfully. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that being humiliated at a bank would lead to all this. She gestured around the conference, where professionals from across the country were networking, sharing ideas, building coalitions. That's the butterfly effect of standing up for what's right, Sandra observed. You never know how far the ripples will reach. Later that evening, they sat side by side at the documentary screening, watching as their story unfolded on screen. not as a simple tale of celebrity rescue, but as a complex examination of age discrimination, financial vulnerability, and the power of refusing to be silenced. When the credits rolled, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Eleanor, looking around at the faces of the First National 34 scattered throughout the theatre, felt a deep sense of completion. What had begun as her personal humiliation had become a movement for dignity, respect, and justice. Outside, the theatre snowflakes drifted through the December evening. Eleanor and Sandra stood for a moment, watching the winter sky. "You know what amazes me most?" Eleanor said softly. 3 months ago, when I walked into that bank, I felt invisible. Like my voice didn't matter. Sandra nodded, understanding. "And now," Eleanor continued, "people are listening not just to me, but to thousands of older adults who have been ignored for too long. That's the real miracle in all of this." As they walked toward the waiting car, Eleanor thought about all, the older people who would never face what she had faced, who would be treated with respect and dignity because of changes now rippling through the financial industry and beyond. The lasting impact couldn't be measured in policy changes or dollars saved, though those were significant. It was measured in something far more precious: the restoration of voice to those who had been silenced, the affirmation of worth to those who had been devalued, and the simple, profound acknowledgement that age does not diminish humanity. And it had all begun with 2 women, one famous, one not, standing together against the casual cruelty of dismissal.